Hello everybody, welcome back to Comedian MTG. My name is Ian. Today we have a very special episode. We have a Crimson Vow commander deck to break down for you guys today. It is one of the brand new spoilers from Crimson Vow. This is my first shot as a deck tech for this commander. It's in my favorite color combination in all of Magic, and I'm super excited to bring you this deck tech today. If you like videos like this, make sure to hit like and subscribe. And if you're interested in supporting the channel, make sure to head over to patreon.com/comedianmtg. Any support helps the channel a ton. So today's deck is Eruth Tormented Prophet. It is a brand new Crimson Vow commander that says, if you would draw a card, exile the top 2 cards of your library. Instead, you may play those cards this turn. So just on its face level, Eruth allows you to double your draw for the turn, which is already pretty strong. For only 3 mana, it comes out of the gates super early. In a bunch of my test hands, I've been able to get Eruth out as early as turn 1. Now, you don't actually always want that to be the case, but it is a potential for this list. So what are we trying to do in this deck? Basically, with the way Eruth works, we want to be able to turn card draw into even stronger card draw. So for example, effects that would say something like draw 3 cards and then have some sort of downside to them end up usually just becoming exile the top 6 cards of your library for something as cheap as a single mana, which is super strong, and which allows us to turn this commander into a pretty aggressive storm deck. Now we're playing classic win conditions. Obviously, being an Is a deck in the modern era, we want to be on Underworld Breach, and with Lion's Eye Diamond and Brain Freeze in the deck, we're able to generate enough storm and mill out our opponents. But us having basically a traditional storm deck here, I felt we also should include a hard storm win con, and that is Aetherflux Reservoir. Aetherflux Reservoir is just kind of the perfect outlet for any storm deck. It is so strong. It is colorless mana to drop down on the table, so any reducers reduce that very effectively, and by the time your 10th spell is being cast, you have enough life total to kill 1 person. And with a storm deck like this, when you're churning through so many cards, it is very easy to get to a position where you're able to cast and use Reservoir to take out your opponents. So let's start talking about those effects that we're trying to break. Those effects that get insanely better when you have Eruth on the battlefield. A classic example, one that's not special to this deck, is something like Brainstorm. Now, a lot of the time with this deck, you'll notice that you actually don't have a hand much anymore when you start trying to pop off, because you can play things like Brainstorm that ask you to put certain cards back, but when you're exiling the top 6 cards of your library, you really don't care that you don't have an actual hand. Now, one thing to note about this deck in particular, and one thing that's going to be very obvious from the very beginning, is that this deck is commander-centric and uses exile a lot, meaning that its biggest weakest is going to be Drannith Magistrate. Drannith Magistrate is just a game over for this deck. So if you don't have removal in your hand, and you go to start your next turn with Eruth on the battlefield, and you're exiling top 2 cards of your library, and you don't have an answer, you basically get locked out of the game from Drannith. So just to note that is a huge stopper for this deck, and I want to start that at the beginning of this video so people are aware of the huge kind of hole in the strategy. But back to the cards that are really cool and really fun to break with this commander. So any wheel effect, things like Wheel of Fortune, Windfall, and Time Twister suddenly become shuffle your hand away, no matter what your hand side is, and then draw 14 cards. That is so big. Drawing 14 cards is absolutely huge. Speaking of these wheels, one thing you can actually do with them because of the way your commander works is the draw is actually replaced with the exiling of 2 cards, meaning you will never be able to deck yourself while your commander is on the battlefield if you have an effect that would say draw. So if you're going through loops with Underworld Breach, or maybe even just doing manual Stormcast, you can actually mill out your opponents by going to draw with one of these effects. So for example, if you have Underworld Breach, LED, and Wheel of Fortune, you can keep casting the spell over and over again, and while your opponents are slowly drawing through their deck, you're actually not going to be doing that because you would just be exiling more and more cards. And eventually you're going to get to the point where nobody has a library, but instead of you drawing and decking yourself with your opponents, you're actually just making them deck themselves. So that's something that's kind of cool with these wheels. On top of the fact that when you're storming off, and you're able to pay 3 mana to draw 14 cards, the game's usually pretty much in the bag at that point. One of the spicier options you get to play here is 2 cards that basically have the same effect, and that's Goblin Lore and Control the Court. Now these cards allow you to draw 4 cards, and then you would do something like discard 3 at random. They both ask you to draw 4 and discard 3 at random. So what's going to happen with these effects in this deck is that you get to draw 4 cards, but that gets replaced with your commander. So you instead get to exile the top 8 cards of your library to be played this turn for only 2 mana, and then it asks you to discard cards at random. However, by the time you're playing these effects, you shouldn't really have any cards in your hand, meaning that Control the Court becomes just draw 8 basically with no downside. Now, sometimes you are going to have extra things in your hand, and that's really hard to avoid, but apart from that, this effect is super strong, and you definitely get to a point when you're popping off of this deck where you don't care about the cards that were like in your hand at one point, where you just have like 20 something cards in exile ready to keep storming off. Down to the 1-drop sorceries, we have some of the spiciest cards in the entire deck. We have Overmaster, which in this deck is not just good, but it makes the next instant sorcery you count uncastable, and it also just exiles the top 2 cards of your library, so it's better than just cantripping. Gitaxian Probe is a free exile the top 2. Faithless Looting, as I mentioned, for the downside with Control the Court and Goblin Lore, it kind of gets negated with the way this deck works. And Flashback on this card is also extremely strong with your commander, because you cast it that first time, you draw 2, discard 2, exile the top 4 if your commander's out, and then if you don't have a hand, you can still flash it back, and then once again, that becomes just a 3 mana draw 4 out of the graveyard. Careful Study is not usually played in a lot of Storm decks, but once again here, with the downside being negated, it says draw 2, which means you exile the top 4. Huge in this deck. We get to play one of my favorite cards of all time, Burning Inquiry. I love breaking parity on this card, and this deck feels like the perfect place to do it. While your hands of your opponents are being torn to shreds and they're discarding cards at random, you're exiling the top 6, getting rid of some cards you don't really care about, and it's just a 1 mana draw 6. That's a double Ancestral Recall for your deck. Speaking of double Ancestral Recalls, how about 1 mana, draw 8 cards? With Breakthrough, it's draw 4 cards, then choose X cards in your hand and discard the rest. So normally you have to empty your hand, but with this, you're just exiling the top 8, so you can play them this turn, and you don't really care what happens to your hand. There's a lot of really broken stuff that this deck can do, and it's super cool. The raw card draw of this deck is absolutely insane. So as I mentioned, we have things like Underworld Breach as recursion engines in the deck. Something I mentioned about the other enchantments here is that Mystic Remora and Rhystic Study do get really awkward with your commander on the battlefield. Now, if you're about to storm off and you already have one of these pieces out so that when your opponents go to interact with you, you're exiling more, that's super awesome. But with your commander out and say you're not winning that turn, which hopefully isn't the case because the whole point is that you do have these and you can just play your commander and then pass around the table and win with that commander on the battlefield. But if you have one of these out and your commander and you're not actively going to win the next turn, it's a little awkward to just be like exiling things, hoping you hit interaction from exile, and there's just some awkwardness between these two with the way the deck works. There's still some of the best draw effects in the entire format, so you play them because they're still really good. But just to note, for piloting the deck, they do leave some awkwardness. Another all-star card in the deck is Frantic Search. It's a free exile the top 4 cards of your library, and it also, once again, has the negative side of discarding, but you don't really care. Desperate Ravings is a card that I've always thought was really cool, but never been able to play. And here, once again, just another Faithless Looting type effect. You're exiling top 4, discarding a random card, doesn't really matter, has flashback, it's very powerful in this deck. Playing High Tide. Now, we don't have the most islands in the list. I think we are on, if you count the 5 islands normally, we are on Mystic Sanctuary, which counts as those, Steam Vents, Volcanic Island, and 1 snow-covered island. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 9. 9 islands in the deck, and once again, that doesn't include all of the fetch lands that can grab them, which brings it up to about 17 ways that you can grab those cards out of your deck. So still an impressive amount of stuff that you can use to grab those cards, and a good amount of islands for the deck, enough that Mystic Sanctuary and High Tide still feel really strong. One of the things that kind of feels necessary when you're playing High Tide in this deck, and one of the reasons we're on it, is just the biggest downside that I've noticed in playing this list, which is you can generate a ridiculous, and I mean ridiculous, amount of card draw, but eventually you will run out of mana. And the biggest downside of goldfishing this deck is that problem. Some things to note about this deck in particular that don't help this issue: Simian Spirit Guide only makes you mana if you exile it from your hand. Mox Diamond only goes to the battlefield if you discard a land card, i.e. from your hand. Chrome Mox, you have to imprint a non-artifact card from your hand. If you're noticing here, there is a theme of cards that you wish would work and normally work in every other deck that don't work in this deck because of the way the commander works. So, with 3 of our best free rituals being kind of cut off, that's definitely something to note about the deck when you're trying to storm off with it. We definitely play some more creative options because of that. We're on things like Springleaf Drum, which actually works decently with the way your commander works. I'm using a couple of reducers. I'm using Helm of Awakening for literally everything being reduced. That's one of those cards that you definitely don't play that in pass. You definitely play it on the turn you're trying to win. Baral, we're playing to reduce our instant sorceries. Same with Goblin Electromancer. One card that helps a ton with the mana issue, Dockside obviously, but more specifically, Burgi and Stormkiln Artist help a ton. And basically if you resolve those cards, the mana issue of the deck really does more than likely go away. Burgi allows your spells to be refunded for a single red. If you play anything for free, now you're netting mana, and you have a decent amount of red cards in the deck that should provide you enough value to really power through your deck. Stormkiln Artist, everyone who I know who's been working on an Eruth list talks about how Stormkiln Artist is one of the best cards in the deck. It's the reason I got this tech from some people in the Comedian MTG Discord. A fantastic place to come if you want to brew the new decks in the format, by the way. They've been working on Grolnok a lot lately. We've been working on this deck, me with my different version, stuff like that. We have like 6 different people trying different Grolnok versions in our Discord, and the Comedian MTG Discord is such a fun place during spoiler season because all these cards are being talked about and brewed around. But Stormkiln Artist, one of the reasons I found out that people were on Imperial Recruiter, and I definitely adopted that technology, was to find Stormkiln Artist, because it really takes away a lot of your mana issues. Suddenly, if you're, casting a Cataxian Probe and netting mana from it, or you're playing things like your Breakthrough, which is 1 mana, now refunding itself mana-wise, and then exiling the top 8, makes your mana issues in this deck really go away quite fast. So the card feels pretty necessary in this deck. It's very strong, and at some points in the game, in grindier games, it can actually turn into a win con, which is kind of funny. You definitely should not rely on that, but it's just something to note that it's one of those cards that can just sort of practically turn into a giant beater. And earlier I talked about recursion in the graveyard. We're taking a piece from modern Blue-Red Storm. We're playing Past in Flames. Once again, the idea being that you're kind of pitching a lot of these cards to these type of effects, and you're casting a lot of spells. And when you're really just trying to do actual factual storm, Past in Flames is a pretty good option, and definitely helps with some of the discard effects, as I mentioned before. So it's kind of nice there. And we play a ridiculous amount of instants and sorceries. We have 25 instants and 15 sorceries. So definitely something worth noting that it's Past in Flames is going to be on for a lot of the spells in our deck. The only other thing worth mentioning is the untap effects. As I mentioned, mana is an issue. So things like Dramatic Reversal, Snap, Turnabout, Frantic Search, all of those things feel pretty necessary. We aren't like a turbo High Tide deck or anything crazy like that, but it definitely helps to have these untappers, especially when you're playing things like cost reducers, like I mentioned before, like Baral, Goblin Electromancer, Helm of Awakening. Those things and the untap effects really start to add up and allow you to generate mana, as opposed to just consistently keep losing it until you run out. A spicy include for this deck, because of how many cheap artifacts we're running. I'm playing Paradoxical Outcome. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 0 mana artifacts, and we have a bunch of 1-mana artifacts that replace themselves mana-wise, not to mention all the reducers that we have in the deck. So given that, Paradoxical Outcome feels pretty strong. You can just bounce all your stuff back to your hand. It's easy to reduce because it only has 1 blue colored pip, and it draws you cards, which means it exiles double what it would normally draw you. Pretty cool card, interesting tech piece. I don't know if it's going to make the cut because 4 mana is still a lot even with the reducers, so it's worked decently for me as of right now. I am having a ton of fun goldfishing this deck a lot. I haven't gotten too many pods with like actually playing it in because I want to still work on the mana issue, and I think there are ways to optimize it even more. Right now, the mana issue has kind of stopped me, as I said, bringing it into some pods, but I'm having a ton of fun playing with this deck, just kind of brewing around it, switching spots in and out, doing goldfishing, trying to really get those numbers down perfectly. But in the meantime, I wanted to bring you all this list today because I'm having a lot of fun with it. It's super cool. It's just such classic Is It Commander, and as I mentioned, it's my favorite color combination, and turning your card draw into like turbo card draw is super fun. It's not like ad nauseum turbo, it's just super aggressive storm stuff. It's a really unique commander, a really unique ability. It allows you to break really weird cards like Breakthrough and Control the Court and Goblin Lore, which are cards I never thought I would see in cEDH, and it turns those cards into something kind of broken and degenerate, and it leads to really, really cool, unique, fun gameplay. So it's a really fun list. I'm glad to have been working on it. I'm excited to see if people pick this up, and if anyone has like optimizations for their version of the list, I'd love to hear about those in the comments down below. I would love to hear comments about if you guys have tried Eruth, if anyone's had success with decks, maybe link to deck list down and below. And I would love to hear if people have a solution to the mana problem, because it's definitely an issue with the deck, and I'd love to hear any sort of brainstorming that people have about that. I still think the deck is very fun. I definitely think you could still bring it to a pod in cEDH and still have a great time. There's definitely, I think, as of right now, the current variation, there's going to be some variance games and a lot of variance games. As I mentioned, things like Drannith, like we are playing a decent amount of removal, but Drannith is still a problem for this deck to go up against. So little things like that. At the end of the day, I would still recommend giving this deck a shot. Eruth is such a cool legendary creature. I'm so excited that they printed such a cool card in my favorite colors, and I'm so excited to have played this deck, and I'm looking forward to seeing if people can get games with me on it. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me for this deck tech. If you liked this video, please make sure to hit like and subscribe. It helps the channel more than I can even say, and I love seeing people show up for this channel and this deck. If you want to see more stuff like this, please tell me down in the comment down below. And if you're feeling extra generous, the Patreon has been relaunched. We worked on new tiers, stuff like that. So come check that out. And as I mentioned before, the Discord is where I have been doing most of my brewing with this card. People like Phoenix and Gustav and Dragoon and a lot of the people on our Discord, and Iraqi, David, all fantastic people who have been doing a lot of brewing and being able to come to this space over and over again with new ideas and fresh commanders. It's so fun. I love that Comedian MTG Discord has turned into this awesome brewing space. We just are adding more and more channels all the time for cool brews, and it's one of my favorite things to do. So thank you to everybody in the Discord. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Peace.